hey, it's Friday, let's talk about a book. Maybe a more abridged version than usual because I was sick when I was originally supposed to film this, but I very much want us to talk about The Improvisers by Nicole Glover today. But before we jump into the book, hi, my name is Melody. We talk about books and book adjacent things on this channel, and on ideally every Friday we dive deeper into a specific book, whether we want to call that a conversation, whether we want to call that a review, however we want to think about it, we are going to talk about this book today. Now, this came out in November and I missed talking about it because I didn't do an anticipated releases video for that month, but I was pretty excited about this book and then I lost track of its publication, and so I had a very happy stumbling upon it at the library and checking it out immediately, and it went to the top of my TBR pile because this is the newest from Nicole Glover, who you may remember as one of the early feature Fridays on this channel for The Conductors, and then I also featured The Undertakers in a sequel spotlight that I did because I really loved those books, especially Hetty and Benji, who were the center of those books. And so this release was admittedly a little bittersweet for me in some ways because I knew that this book was not going to be centered around Hetty and Benji, and I had fallen in love with them and I wanted more murder mystery adventures with them and watching them develop in their relationship, but that is not what we were going to get. Instead, we were jumping to the 30s with this book. What I didn't realize is that we were going to be in the same magical world as the Conductors and the Undertakers. Now, there is some give and take with that in terms of how that magical world is realized, because at its heart, that initial duology and this book really are a historical, fantastical murder mystery romance. Though ending on romance probably isn't the smartest because the romance isn't the complete driver of things, but it is a very large subplot. I would argue even more of a central subplot than in the Conductors and the Undertakers, simply because it proceeds quicker or it moves faster in this book. The payoff of it moves faster in this book. So anyway, back to the world. We're in the same magical and logistical world, but we are now following a descendant, a granddaughter, in fact, of Hetty and Benji. And this granddaughter, Velma, has a storied history of her own. And I kind of apologize in advance in that I'm going to be talking about this book largely in conversation with the other two in terms of how it's set up and what is going on, just because that is my closest frame of reference, and also because I really loved those books, and if you haven't read them, I hope you will pick them up. But in those books, we are walking into a story already ongoing in terms of Hetty and Benji having a storied past and a past within their relationship, even from the moment we step within the story. And so we are really thrust in to a really robust interior life for these characters. And we have the same here in terms of Velma having a really colorful backstory. We start the book with some newspaper clippings and articles that kind of chronicle a feud with Dylan, a newspaper reporter who is kind of taking umbrage with the new fad of flying in planes versus broomsticks. And Velma is an aviatrix known for her stunts as a pilot, and we open the book on her doing an exhibition in Chicago for her flying. But she also used to be a reporter at a newspaper where she had an ongoing feud with Dylan. So even with these two, we have this more kind of developed backstory between them stepping into this world like we had with Hetty and Benji. And I absolutely adore Hetty and Benji. So here we have Velma, who also works for a kind of magical detective agency at the end of the day. And so if the Conductors and the Undertakers was really kind of contained within the community and kind of bound by logistics of geography, this book and us moving into the future and specifically making Velma a pilot really opens us up to the entire country in terms of Velma's community, which we take advantage of really extensively in this book. And so as Velma is sent on this kind of mission that kind of dominoes in terms of how big this case is, what starts out as a mysterious letter from a not particularly well-liked uncle sets the course for something that kind of culminates in a very kind of locked room murder mystery-esque scenario, which I choose to believe is also an homage to the state of detective fiction at the time that the book is taking place. But again, when we circle back to this idea of community, which is one of the things that I loved so much about the conductors and the undertakers, as much as I loved Hetty and Benji with my whole heart, the kind of cast of characters built up around them really helped elevate the entire story, and is one of the reasons too I'm still really bitter that the option for those books has not gone anywhere, because I think it's perfectly primed for adaptation with that really robust cast of characters. That Glover really manages to endear me as a reader to many of these characters where I am meant to be endeared in a very small amount of space, and she also really cements motivations and roots motivations for these characters in a very small amount of space, which is really impressive when we think about especially the scope of this book. It is about 400, just shy of 450 pages, so it's not necessarily a short book by any means, but when I think of everything that happens in this book, we span a lot of space, because even within the first kind of half of the book, we are really kind of settling into this world and passing the torch to Velma in some ways. We very actively start with this exhibition, this idea that things aren't quite right. We get a sense of Velma, we get a sense of her backstory, we get a sense that she is very independent and is slow to trust, and all of this going on. And then we eventually watch as she, or the case she is on, takes her to her grandparents' house, and we as readers get to interact with an aged up Hetty and Benji, which is just a joy. It is a joy to see Hetty and Benji and their legacy and watch them interact with their granddaughter, watch the way that their family has expanded and their community has expanded, and watch how Velma kind of sits within that, and see her and this book take on a life of its own, even amidst this connection to this previous work. And this is interesting because in many ways this is a new book. It doesn't necessarily have to be read with the other two to be appreciated. That being said, if we circle back to the magic system, which from the beginning of my interaction with these books has always been the kind of weakest link in some ways. I love the magic system that's set up and the way it's explained in the conductors, but I also don't know if it's fully realized to the extent that it could be. That being said, because there are so many other elements in these books, primarily the mystery and romantic elements, I'm not as worried about the magic system. The magic system kind of functions honestly similarly to, for me as a reader, though they are vastly different books and series, the Arcane Society novels, which I've mentioned multiple times before, but those are historical romance, historical thriller romance with this supernatural bend. And so there is a supernatural magical element there, but a lot of it is kind of taken on faith because it is just the kind of given circumstances of everything else going on and heightening these. Now, what is really interesting is how the magic has kind of morphed in the time that has passed between the original series and the world of the 30s that we are now living in this book, because we've still got this idea of celestial magic and magic being segregated in a lot of ways. And so there is a lot of historical and social commentary that is being made through the way magic is utilized and suppressed, especially within this book, and the way that magic is used within the context of prohibition as well is really interesting. I think that to appreciate the way that the magic has evolved from the other books, you of course have to have read the other books, and I don't know if the celestial magic or this kind of invoking of the stars and constellations makes as much sense on its own without the context of where that magic is coming from. At the same time, I think that a lot of that is given circumstance as well. I think you can draw the lines of where celestial magic would be coming from, but again, a lot of that is just kind of given circumstances of the world in the way that these characters are operating, and the magic is taken for granted. Now, there are times then, of course, where the magic is utilized in a fight or an escape or a big climax where it doesn't feel as tangible as a reader, in the sense that I don't know necessarily the costs of that magic in the same ways that I might in a fantasy with a more robustly kind of executed magic system. But at the same time, again, that wasn't a particular hang up for me. It's something that I could kind of clock intellectually as I was reading, but it didn't necessarily reduce my enjoyment of the book in any way because I was having such a good time. I think these books, and part of what draws me to these books, or why I respond so much to these books, is that they kind of scratch an itch for me, similar to a lot of the lighter fantasy, romantic fantasy, mystery fantasy that I was reading as a teenager in the 2000s. And so there's something really satisfying in them. Along with that, of course, is the community that I loved so much from the original duology. And here we're seeing that expanded quite a lot. And so it's very interesting because the community is still there, but in a very different way. We've got all of these different little pockets of the community, and the way that Velma's life in some ways is kind of segmented between these different communities, and we see within this story how they all kind of come together to help her solve this mystery, which is really satisfying. Now with this, there are some characters like her cohort at the Muses, Lois, who runs the archives, that I would have loved to get to know more because I found them so endearing. But I think that that again speaks to the way that Glover is able to draw really fully formed characters in a very short amount of time. And that is down to the relationship with Dylan as well, because the tension between these two is so delicious and evident from page one, essentially, because we're seeing it played out in these documents. And so from the beginning, we have this tension and this history that is evident through their rivalry at the paper, but over the course of the book, Glover keeps feeding us tidbits that really deepen that kind of connection between the two as they are thrust together during the course of this case, but also the way that fate has kind of stepped in other ways, and sometimes more than fate. And there's just more of a history between these two than is first evident. And listen, I love Benji, so I was not expecting to love Dylan quite as much as I did, but I should have been, because I am a romance reader, and I know that we can love so many romantic leads and get to experience the joy of love in so many different varieties. And Dylan's energy is so much different. He is very focused on his journalistic career. He has a high moral compass in that at one point he is run out of Chicago for writing articles revealing some corruption that gets him into some hot water, but he's almost kind of blasé about it in some ways, and he knows how to needle Velma, but he's also very astute and sharp and observant because, again, he is a very highly respected reporter. And so there is just a really delicious banter that can go on between these two because, again, it is a meeting of the minds on a similar playing field, and there is a respect there, even when at the beginning it doesn't seem like there is, because he really is kind of talking down to the concept of flying, but that really goes out the window, and I think the way it all develops is really fun. That being said, within the kind of pacing of their relationship, I started to get a little worried because it felt like we hadn't kind of circled back to them at all in around the 100 to 200 page mark. And again, I think that goes back to the first half really establishing, moving us into this world, establishing Velma, giving us who have read the initial series that kind of passing of the baton. I almost said wand. Wands kind of come up here in some ways, but not really. But we do have that magical element. But we get to see her take the helm of these investigations, and the way the scale of the investigation really explodes in this as we are again flying cross country, searching down magical artifacts and chasing leads, often from Velma's past. And there were times where the different kind of suspects and characters started to get a little convoluted for me, but again, I was just so sucked into the world, I didn't really care, and also that could have just been a me issue. But I just think these books are so fun and so underrated at the end of the day. I don't know why more people aren't talking about them. I love Hetty and Benji so much. While there is still a part of me that resents not getting more of Hetty and Benji, I am so grateful and excited to have met Velma and Dylan, and am very excited and hopeful that we will get to continue in this world now. And so for us to continue in this world, I need you to read these books. So if you have read this book, which the odds aren't great on because there weren't a whole lot of ratings when I read it, but if you have, let me know what you thought. If you haven't, I highly encourage you to. If you want to start at the beginning, last I checked, The Conductors was available on Kindle Unlimited, as well as it obviously being available on all major platforms and for you to buy or borrow from your library. And I would very much encourage you to check out that book because, again, I love it. So yeah, check it out, report back. Thank you for hanging out and being interested in my thoughts, especially if you haven't read this book yet. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good, and yeah, bye.